My hands are shaking as I hold this letter, and not from old age, mind you. I'm 73, but I've got the steady hands of a woman who's sewn quilts and tended gardens for decades. No, this trembling comes from something else entirely, something that chills me to the bone. But before we dive into this shocking story, if you're new to Madam Susan Stories, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, trust me. You don't want to miss what happens next in Eleanor's tale. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from around the world and what time it is where you are. I love connecting with viewers from different time zones. Inside this envelope is a photograph of my beloved Walter's headstone, and written across it in what looks like blood, though I pray it's just red ink, are the words, "You shouldn't have done that, Mom." But here's the thing that's got my heart racing like a hummingbird's wings. I don't think my son Greg sent this, and if he didn't, who did? Before I tell you about this terrifying letter that showed up on my doorstep just last week, I need to take you back to where this nightmare began. Back to the day that changed everything between a mother and her only child. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I live in the same brick house that Walter and I built with our own two hands 48 years ago, just outside Charleston, South Carolina. Every board, every nail, every drop of sweat that went into this place, we did it together. This house isn't just where we lived, it's where we loved, where we dreamed, where we raised our son Greg. Walter passed away last year, quietly in his sleep, just the way he would have wanted. Losing him felt like losing half of my soul. We'd been married for 51 years, and I thought I knew what grief was. I thought the hardest part would be learning to sleep alone in our big oak bed, or making coffee for one instead of two. I was wrong. The hardest part, the part that nearly killed me, came from the last person on earth I expected it from. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I found Walter still and peaceful in his sleep. The morning sun was streaming through our lace curtains, the same ones I'd hung 30 years ago, and for just a moment, I thought he was simply sleeping late, but then I touched his hand. After the paramedics came and went, after the funeral director left with his business cards and gentle condolences, I sat alone in our kitchen, the same kitchen where Walter had kissed me goodbye every morning for nearly 5 decades. I needed to make the hardest phone call of my life. I dialed Greg's number with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. My son lives about 4 hours away in Atlanta with his wife Ashley, the woman who, in the 15 years since they married, has never once called me Mom. It's always been Eleanor with her, like I'm some distant acquaintance, rather than the woman who gave birth to her husband. The phone rang 3 times before Greg picked up. I can still hear his voice, distracted and impatient, like I was interrupting something important. "Hey Mom, what's up? I'm kind of busy with..." "Greg," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Your father, Walter, he passed away this morning." You know what I expected? I expected shock. I expected grief. I expected my grown son to break down and cry for the man who taught him to ride a bike, who sat through every little league game, who worked double shifts to pay for his college education. Instead, there was silence. Not the stunned silence of grief, but the calculating silence of someone doing math in their head. "Oh," he finally said. "Oh, Mom, when is the funeral?" "Saturday," I told him. "The funeral home can do it Saturday at 2 o'clock. I know it's short notice, but..." And that's when my world crumbled. "Saturday," Greg interrupted. "Mom, you know Ashley's birthday is that weekend. We already have reservations in Savannah. The whole weekend's planned. Can't you do it Friday instead?" I thought I'd misheard him. I actually asked him to repeat what he'd just said, because surely my son hadn't just asked me to reschedule his father's funeral around a birthday dinner. But he had. "Greg," I said, my voice getting stronger despite the tears streaming down my cheeks. "This is your father's funeral. Your father, who loved you more than his own life." "I know that, Mom, but Ashley's had this birthday weekend planned for months. All her friends are coming. I can't just cancel everything." "Can't just cancel everything?" "For his father's funeral. I want you to imagine the most disappointing moment of your life. Maybe it was when someone you trusted broke their promise, or when you realized someone you loved didn't love you back the same way. Now multiply that feeling by 1,000, and you might come close to what I felt sitting in that kitchen, holding the phone, listening to my only child explain why his wife's birthday party was more important than burying his father. "Mom, be reasonable," Greg continued, and I could hear Ashley's voice in the background, sharp and insistent, though I couldn't make out the words. "We've already put deposits down. Ashley's invited 20 people. You can't just expect us to throw away all that money." Money. He was talking about money while his father lay still and cold in the next room. "Greg," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I need you here. I need my son here when we lay your father to rest. And I'll be there, Mom. Just, can it be Friday? Or maybe the following weekend?" The following weekend. Like Walter was a dentist appointment that could be rescheduled for convenience. I looked around our kitchen, Walter's coffee cup still sitting in the sink from yesterday morning, his reading glasses folded neatly on the counter beside yesterday's newspaper. The newspaper he'd never finish reading, the crossword puzzle he'd never complete. "The funeral is Saturday at 2, I said quietly. "I hope you'll be there." And I hung up. For the next 3 days, I waited. I kept thinking Greg would call back, that he'd come to his senses. I imagined him showing up at the door with tears in his eyes, saying he'd been in shock, that of course he would be there for his father's final goodbye. But he didn't call. Friday evening, as I sat in the funeral home, going over the final arrangements with Mr. Patterson, a kind man who'd buried half the people I'd known and loved over the years, I still held on to hope. Maybe Greg would surprise me. Maybe he'd walk through those doors and wrap his arms around me and tell me he was sorry, that he'd made a terrible mistake. Saturday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of day that matches a grieving heart. I put on my black dress, the one Walter had always said made me look elegant, and drove to the church where we'd been married 51 years ago. The sanctuary was quiet, too quiet for a man like Walter who had touched so many lives. Mrs. Henderson from next door was there, bless her heart. She'd brought a casserole every week since Walter died, and never once made me feel like a burden. The Kowalskis from down the street came, and old Pete from the hardware store where Walter bought supplies for all his home projects. But the front pew, the pew where family sits, had only me. I kept looking toward the back of the church, praying I'd see Greg's tall frame walking through those doors. I'd forgiven him already in my heart, you understand. All he had to do was show up, and I would have forgotten every harsh word from that phone call. 2 o'clock came and went. The pastor, Reverend Mills, began the service with such kindness in his voice. He talked about Walter's dedication to our family, his love for his son, his pride in watching Greg graduate college and start his own life. And through it all, I sat alone. When it came time for family to speak, Reverend Mills looked at me questioningly. I just shook my head. What was I supposed to say? That Walter's only son had chosen a birthday party over his father's funeral? After we laid Walter to rest in the cemetery beside the old oak tree he'd always loved, I drove home through that gray drizzle and sat in our empty house. The silence was deafening. Not just because Walter was gone, but because my son, our son, had chosen not to be there when we said goodbye to the man who gave him life. That night, I found myself talking to Walter's empty chair. "He wasn't there, honey," I whispered to the darkness. "Our boy wasn't there." And somehow, in that quiet house, I could almost hear Walter's voice saying what he always said when Greg disappointed us. "Give him time, Ellie. He'll come around." But this time felt different. This time felt final. What I didn't know then was that Greg wouldn't call for weeks, wouldn't even send a card or a text to see how I was doing. And when he finally did show up on my doorstep almost a year later, it wouldn't be to apologize. It would be to ask for something that would break my heart all over again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a family member disappoint you this deeply? What would you have done in Eleanor's situation? And don't forget to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I need to paint you a picture of what that Saturday looked like, because I want you to understand just how alone I felt, how betrayed, how utterly abandoned by the one person who should have been there no matter what. The morning of Walter's funeral, I woke up before dawn. Not because I set an alarm, grief doesn't follow schedules. I'd been lying there in our bed, staring at Walter's side where the sheets were still tucked neat and tight, just like he always kept them. "Military habits die hard," he used to say. I made myself a single cup of coffee and sat at our kitchen table, looking out at the garden Walter had tended for decades. His tomato plants were already starting to sprout their first green shoots. He'd planted them just 2 weeks before he passed, talking about how we'd have fresh tomatoes by summer. Now those plants would grow without him ever tasting their fruit. The phone rang at 7:30 that morning. My heart jumped, maybe it was Greg, calling to say he'd changed his mind, that he was driving down from Atlanta right then. It wasn't Greg. It was Ashley. "Eleanor?" Her voice had that syrupy, sweet tone she used when she wanted something. I just wanted to call and explain about this weekend. Greg feels terrible, but you have to understand we've had this party planned for months. My sister flew in from California, and my college roommate drove down from Virginia. We just can't cancel on everyone. I sat there holding the phone, listening to this woman explain why her birthday was more important than my husband's funeral. And the whole time, I could hear party preparations in the background, someone moving furniture, music playing, laughter. On the morning of Walter's funeral. "I'm sure you understand," Ashley continued. "Walter wouldn't want us to waste all that money, would he? He was always so practical about these things." She was using my dead husband's name to justify her selfishness, using Walter's practical nature, his careful budgeting, and hatred of waste to excuse why her party mattered more than his burial. "Ashley," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Walter is being buried today. Your husband's father is being laid to rest, and neither of you will be there." "Well, when you put it like that, you make it sound horrible." "Because it is horrible," I said, and hung up. "Let me ask you something. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Was I wrong to hang up on her? Because part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, too demanding. Maybe grief was making me unreasonable. By 10 o'clock that morning, I was dressed in my black dress and pearls, the ones Walter gave me for our 25th anniversary. I looked in the mirror and saw an old woman, alone, preparing to bury her life partner without her son by her side. The funeral home was as quiet as a tomb, if you'll pardon the expression. Mr. Patterson, bless his soul, kept checking his watch and glancing toward the door. He was waiting for Greg, too. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "would you like us to wait a few more minutes? Sometimes family gets delayed." "Mrs. Whitmore." "No," I told him. "We'll start on time." Walter was never late for anything in his life. Reverend Mills delivered a beautiful service. He talked about Walter's 43 years at the paper mill, how he never missed a day of work until his retirement. He spoke about Walter's devotion to his family, his love for his wife and son. When he mentioned Greg by name, talking about Walter's pride in his boy, I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. The hardest part came when it was time for the family eulogy. In a normal family, that would be the son's honor and responsibility. Instead, I had to stand up there alone, my voice shaking, and tell a handful of neighbors and church friends about the man I'd loved for 51 years. I talked about Walter's gentle hands that could fix anything broken, his terrible jokes that made me roll my eyes and laugh at the same time, the way he still brought me wildflowers from the roadside even after 5 decades of marriage. And through it all, that front pew sat empty except for me. The cemetery was worse. Standing beside Walter's grave, watching them lower his casket into the ground, I kept turning around, expecting to see Greg's car pulling up, him running toward me with apologies and tears. But all I saw was empty road stretching into the distance. You know what the silence sounds like after everyone leaves a funeral? It's not peaceful. It's not restful. It's the kind of silence that screams at you, reminding you of everything that's missing. I drove home from the cemetery that day in Walter's old pickup truck, the blue Ford he'd babied for 15 years, washing it every Saturday morning like clockwork. My hands looked so small on that big steering wheel, and for the first time since Walter died, I felt truly helpless. The house felt different when I walked through the door. Not just because Walter was gone, I'd been dealing with that emptiness for 3 days already. No, it felt different because now I knew my son wasn't coming to comfort me. There would be no knock on the door, no, "Mom, I'm here," no strong arms to hold me while I cried. I sat in Walter's recliner, the brown leather one he'd claimed was perfectly broken in, and stared at the phone. Surely Greg would call that evening. Surely he'd want to know how the service went, if his father had been honored properly, if I was okay. The phone never rang. Sunday came and went, then Monday. By Tuesday, I started wondering if maybe I should call him. Maybe I should be the bigger person, reach out first. But every time I picked up that phone, I heard Ashley's voice in my head. Walter wouldn't want us to waste all that money, and I'd set the phone back down. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. I developed routines to fill the silence. I'd wake up, make coffee for one, tend Walter's garden, and wait. I was always waiting for the phone to ring, for a card in the mail, for some sign that my son remembered he had a mother who was grieving too. Mrs. Henderson from next door became my lifeline. Every Thursday she'd bring over a casserole and stay for coffee. She never asked about Greg directly, but I could see the questions in her eyes. Where was my son? Why wasn't he checking on me? You know. She said one Thursday in September, about 6 months after the funeral, my daughter calls me every Sunday without fail. Has for 20 years. I just nodded and poured more coffee, pretending that comment didn't cut straight through my heart. The holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving came, and I cooked a small turkey just enough for one person, while memories played in my head of all the Thanksgivings Walter and I had hosted when Greg was younger. The dining room table that used to overflow with food and laughter sat empty except for my single plate. Christmas nearly broke me. I'd always made stockings for the family Walters, mine, Greg's, and after he married, one for Ashley too. This year, I couldn't bring myself to hang any stockings at all. What was the point? I kept thinking about previous Christmases when Greg would call by 10 in the morning, eager to tell us about his gifts, to hear about ours. This Christmas, my phone stayed silent all day. And before you ask, yes, I could have called him. But here's the thing, when someone chooses a birthday party over their father's funeral, what exactly are you supposed to say? Hi honey, how was the party while we buried your dad? The worst part wasn't the big occasions though. It was the small moments when something would happen, a funny story on the news that Walter would have loved, or when his favorite song came on the radio and I'd think, I should call Greg and tell him about this. Then I'd remember that Greg had made his choice. He'd chosen Ashley's birthday over his father's memory, and apparently he'd chosen silence over his grieving mother. I started talking to Walter's photograph more and more, the one on the mantle where he's wearing his best suit, the one from our 50th wedding anniversary party. He's really not going to call, is he? I'd ask that photograph. Our boy has really written us off. But Walter's picture just smiled back at me, frozen in time, unable to answer the question that kept me awake at night. How do you grieve a husband while your heart is breaking over a son who's disappeared from your life? I was about to find out that Greg hadn't disappeared at all. He'd just been waiting for the right moment to reappear. And when he did, it would be for all the wrong reasons. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early March, almost exactly 1 year after Walter had passed away. I remember because I'd been sitting in the kitchen, looking at the calendar and realizing that Friday would mark the anniversary of that terrible phone call when I'd told Greg his father was gone. I was debating whether I should call him. Maybe enough time had passed. Maybe grief had softened both our hearts enough that we could find our way back to each other. Then I heard a car door slam in my driveway. My heart started racing. Mrs. Henderson always knocked first, and the mailman never came this late in the day. I walked to the front window and pulled back the lace curtain, and there he was. Greg. He looked older than I remembered. His brown hair was thinning at the temples, and he'd put on weight around his middle. But it was definitely my son, standing there on the front porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he used to do as a little boy when he'd broken something and was working up the courage to tell me. For just a moment, one beautiful, foolish moment, I thought he'd come to apologize. I thought he'd finally realized what he'd done, how much he'd hurt me, and he was here to make things right. I opened the door before he could knock, and the first thing I noticed was his smile. That nervous, guilty smile I knew so well from his childhood. The same smile he'd worn when he broke my grandmother's vase playing baseball in the house, or when he'd gotten caught lying about his report card. "Hi, Mom," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word Mom, like he wasn't sure he still had the right to call me that. "Greg," I managed to say. My voice came out as barely a whisper. We stood there staring at each other across the threshold, literally and figuratively. A year of silence stretched between us, heavy as a storm cloud. Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped back and let him pass, catching a whiff of his cologne, the same expensive stuff Ashley always bought him for Christmas. Even his scent reminded me of her, of the choice he'd made. He walked into our living room like a stranger, looking around at the furniture he'd grown up with as if he'd never seen it before. His eyes lingered on Walter's empty recliner, and for a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt? Regret? I couldn't tell. "The place looks good," he said, which was a lie. I'd let things go this past year. The houseplants Walter used to water were brown and dying, dust-covered surfaces that once gleamed. I'd had no energy for maintaining appearances when there was no one left to maintain them for. "Coffee?" I asked, falling back on the automatic politeness that mothers never lose, even with children who've broken their hearts. "That would be great." I busied myself in the kitchen, grateful for something to do with my hands. They were shaking again, but this time from nerves rather than fear. Greg was here. My son was actually here, sitting at my kitchen table like old times. But as I poured the coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a social call. That nervous smile, the way he kept fidgeting with his car keys, the careful way he was looking around the house, something was off. I set his coffee cup down in front of him, black, no sugar, just the way he'd always liked it, and waited. "Mom," he began, then stopped, started again. "Mom, I know it's been a while." "A year," I said quietly. "It's been a year, Greg." He winced. I know, and look, I wanted to come sooner. I really did, but Ashley thought it would be better to give you some space, some time to." There it was. Ashley's influence, even in his apology. "Time to what?" I asked. "To heal, to get over. You know, the whole funeral thing." The funeral thing. That's what he called it. His father's burial was the whole funeral thing. Right then, I should have known. I should have seen the signs of what was coming. But I was so desperate to have my son back, so hungry for any scrap of family connection, that I ignored every red flag waving in my face. "I'm glad you're here," I said, and meant it. Greg's smile got wider, more confident. "Actually, Mom, Ashley and I were hoping we could talk to you about something important." And there it was, the real reason for his visit. "Actually, Mom, Ashley and I were hoping we could talk to you about something important." Those words hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire. I could smell trouble coming, but I wasn't prepared for what Greg was about to ask me. He leaned forward in his chair, putting on what I recognized as his serious business face, the same expression he'd worn when he was 12, and trying to convince me he needed an expensive new bike for his paper route. "The thing is," he said, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup, "Ashley and I are going through a rough patch financially." I waited. In my 73 years, I've learned that when someone starts a conversation about money, it's best to let them dig their own hole before you respond. "The market's been tough," Greg continued. "Real estate, you know. Ashley's been trying to flip houses, but a couple of deals went south, and we're in a bind." Ashley's house flipping. I'd heard about this hobby of hers through the grapevine. Mrs. Henderson's daughter worked at the bank and sometimes shared more than she should have over coffee. From what I'd gathered, Ashley had fancy ideas about becoming the next home renovation star, but more money going out than coming in. "I'm sorry to hear you're having difficulties," I said carefully. Greg's face brightened, like he thought I was already agreeing to whatever he was about to ask. That's why we thought, well, Ashley had this idea, and it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. "Here it comes," I thought. "This house," Greg said, gesturing around our kitchen, "it's way too big for just you, Mom. All these rooms, all this upkeep. Dad's been gone a year now, and you're here all alone in this big place." My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. "This is my home, Greg." I know, but think about it practically. You could sell this place, get a nice little apartment somewhere with less maintenance, less worry. Maybe one of those senior communities with activities and stuff. A senior community. He wanted to ship me off to some sterile apartment complex where old people go to wait for death. "And the money from the sale," Greg rushed on. "Well, there'd be plenty left over after you get settled somewhere smaller, enough to help Ashley and me get back on our feet." There it was. The real reason for his visit, laid out as clear as day. He wanted me to sell Walter's house, our house, so he could bail out his wife's failed business ventures. I set my coffee cup down with more force than I intended. It clinked against the saucer like a bell tolling. "Let me understand this correctly," I said, my voice getting steadier with each word. "You want me to sell the house your father built with his own hands, the house where you grew up, so you can pay for Ashley's mistakes." Greg's face flushed red. "It's not like that, Mom. It's not about mistakes. It's about family helping family. Family helping family." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Where was this family loyalty when your father was being buried?" I asked. Greg looked away, fidgeting with his car keys again. "Mom, we've been over this. That was different. This is about being practical, about what's best for everyone." "Best for everyone or best for Ashley?" "That's not fair," Greg snapped, and suddenly he sounded like the petulant teenager he'd once been. "Ashley's my wife. We're a team. When she succeeds, I succeed. And when she fails, you come crawling back to Mommy for money," I thought but didn't say. Instead I asked, "How much do you need?" Greg's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "Well, the house would probably sell for around $300,000, maybe more." After you get a small place, there'd be at least $200,000 left, and that would really... $200,000, I repeated slowly. It sounds like a lot, but Mom, this would set us up for life. Ashley's got this new opportunity, a whole development project, and with the right investment. I held up my hand to stop him. I'd heard enough. My son, who couldn't be bothered to attend his father's funeral, was sitting in our kitchen asking me to sell our home to fund his wife's next get-rich-quick scheme. I need to think about this, I said. Greg's smile got even bigger. Of course. Take all the time you need. Maybe you could let us know by tomorrow? Tomorrow. He wanted an answer by tomorrow. I'll call you, I said, standing up to signal that this conversation was over. As I watched Greg walk back to his car, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. He was already counting that money as his. In his mind, this wasn't a request, it was a done deal. But he was about to learn something about his mother that he'd clearly forgotten. I don't give up without a fight. After Greg left, I sat in that kitchen for what felt like hours, staring at the 2 coffee cups on the table. His was empty. He'd drained it quickly, probably eager to get through his sales pitch and get back to Ashley with good news about their windfall. Mine sat half full and stone cold. I kept replaying his words in my head. It's way too big for just you, Mom. Like I was some helpless old woman who couldn't handle living in her own home. Like Walter and I hadn't maintained this place perfectly fine for nearly 5 decades. The worst part was how confident he'd seemed, how certain that I'd just hand over everything Walter and I had built together. $200,000 to fix Ashley's latest mess, and all I had to do was give up the only home I'd ever really known. I picked up Greg's empty cup and carried both of them to the sink. As I washed them, I found myself talking to Walter again. Can you believe it, honey? I said to his picture on the windowsill above the sink. Our son wants us to sell our home so his wife can play real estate mogul again. Walter's face smiled back at me from that old photograph, the one taken at our neighbor's barbecue just 6 months before he died. He looked so happy in that picture, so content, like a man who knew he'd built something lasting. That's when it hit me. Walter had always been prepared for everything. He'd kept meticulous records of every home repair, every tax document, every insurance policy. He'd even left me detailed instructions on how to work the temperamental furnace and which neighbor to call if the basement flooded. Surely he'd left some guidance about the house itself. I dried my hands and walked to our bedroom, to the old oak dresser where Walter kept all our important papers. The top drawer held our marriage certificate, birth certificates, insurance policies, all organized in Walter's neat handwriting. But as I looked through everything, I realized something was missing: Walter's will. I knew he had one. We'd both made wills years ago with a lawyer in town, but I couldn't find his copy anywhere. That's when I remembered something Walter used to do when he wanted to hide birthday or Christmas presents from me. He'd slip them behind our wedding photo on the dresser, in the space between the frame and the mirror. Our wedding photo, the one where we both looked so young and hopeful, standing on the church steps 49 years ago. Walter in his rented suit, me in my mother's wedding dress, both of us grinning like we'd won the lottery. I carefully lifted the heavy silver frame, and there it was, a manila envelope, sealed and yellowed with age, in Walter's careful handwriting across the front, "For Eleanor, when the time comes." My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a copy of Walter's will, dated just 3 years ago. The second was a letter in his handwriting. I read the will first, and my heart started pounding. Most of it was standard. I inherited everything, as expected. But there was a clause near the end that I'd never seen before. In the event that my son Gregory shows disrespect for family obligations or proves himself unworthy of the Whitmore family legacy, ownership of the family home at 412 Magnolia Street shall transfer immediately to the Charleston Baptist Church Building Fund to be used for housing assistance for families in need. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Walter had anticipated this. Somehow, he'd known that Greg might one day put money above family, and he'd planned for it. But it was the letter that really took my breath away. My dearest Eleanor, it began in Walter's familiar script. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and something has happened to make you question Greg's character. I pray I'm wrong, but I've watched our son change over the years, watched Ashley's influence grow stronger, and I've seen the way money matters more to them than people. The letter went on for 2 pages, and with every word, I felt like Walter was right there in the room with me, his hand on my shoulder, guiding me through the most difficult decision of my life. "The house we built together represents more than wood and brick," he'd written. "It represents the values we tried to teach our son: hard work, family loyalty, putting others before yourself. If Greg has forgotten those values, then maybe it's time for our home to teach those lessons to others who will appreciate them." At the very end, Walter had added a line that made me cry and smile at the same time. "Whatever you decide, Ellie, I trust your judgment completely. You've never let me down, not once in 51 years. Follow your heart, but remember, sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the right thing to do." I sat there on our bed, holding Walter's letter, and for the first time since he'd died, I felt like I wasn't facing this alone. Walter had given me a choice, and deep in my heart, I already knew what that choice would be. But first, I wanted to see how far Greg was willing to push this. I didn't sleep that night. Not a wink. I lay in bed holding Walter's letter, reading it over and over again by the light of my bedside lamp. Every word felt like a conversation with my husband, like he was speaking to me from beyond the grave. By morning, I'd made my decision. But I wasn't going to tell Greg right away. No, I wanted to see exactly how this was going to play out. I wanted to know just how far my son was willing to go to get his hands on Walter's house. Greg called at 9 o'clock sharp, just like I knew he would. "Morning, Mom." His voice was bright and cheerful, like we'd had the most pleasant visit in the world yesterday. "Did you have a chance to think about what we discussed?" "I did," I said carefully. "And? What do you think? Makes sense, right? You getting somewhere smaller, us getting back on our feet, everybody wins." Everybody wins. Except Walter, who'd be spinning in his grave knowing his son wanted to sell the house they'd built together nail by nail. "I want to discuss it with you and Ashley together," I said. "This affects both of you, so you should both be here." There was a pause. I could practically hear Greg's brain working, trying to figure out if this was good news or bad news. "Sure, absolutely," he said finally. "When were you thinking?" "Today. This afternoon. 2 o'clock. "Today? Mom, that's pretty short notice. Ashley's got appointments, and I've got—" "Greg," I interrupted, letting a little steel creep into my voice. "If this is as urgent as you made it sound yesterday, then surely you can both clear your schedules for one afternoon." Another pause. Then, Okay, we'll be there. 2 o'clock. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, not because it needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I made Walter's favorite cookies, snickerdoodles, though I couldn't say why. Maybe I wanted the house to smell like home when I said goodbye to it. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard 2 car doors slam in my driveway. Through the window, I watched Greg and Ashley walk up to my front door. Ashley was dressed like she was going to a business meeting, sharp suit, high heels, briefcase in hand. She meant business. I opened the door before they could knock. "Eleanor," Ashley said with that fake smile of hers, "thank you so much for considering our proposal. I think you're going to love what we've put together for you." She sailed past me into the living room like she owned the place, Greg trailing behind her, looking nervous. They'd prepared a presentation. Ashley spread papers across my coffee table, printouts of apartment complexes, financial projections, even a timeline for the house sale. "Now," Ashley said, settling into Walter's recliner like it was her personal throne, "I've done all the research. There's a lovely senior community just 15 minutes from here. 1-bedroom apartments starting at $800 a month, all utilities included, community dining room, activities coordinator." She talked for 20 minutes straight, laying out their plan for my life like I was a chess piece they could move around the board. Greg nodded along, occasionally adding comments like, "Doesn't that sound perfect, Mom?" And you'd love it there. Through it all, I sat quietly, Walter's letter folded in my pocket like a secret weapon. Finally, Ashley finished her pitch and sat back with a triumphant smile. "So, what do you think? Are you ready to start this exciting new chapter?" Exciting new chapter. That's what she called shipping me off to some retirement community so she could have my money. "It's very thorough," I said. "You've obviously put a lot of thought into this." Ashley beamed. "I knew you'd appreciate the planning. I'm very detail-oriented." "I can see that, but I have a question for you both." Greg leaned forward eagerly. "Sure, Mom. What is it?" I took Walter's letter out of my pocket and unfolded it slowly, watching their faces. Ashley's smile faltered slightly when she saw the old paper, Walter's handwriting. "I found something yesterday," I said. Something Walter left for me. Something I think you both need to hear." The room went completely silent except for the tick of Walter's old grandfather clock in the corner. And that's when I told them about the will. Tell me in the comments, what do you think Greg and Ashley's reaction was when Eleanor revealed Walter's plan? And don't forget to let me know where you're watching from around the world. The truth was about to change everything. You should have seen their faces when I started reading Walter's letter out loud. Ashley's confident smile melted away like ice cream in August, and Greg went pale as fresh snow. "What do you mean Dad left conditions in his will?" Greg asked, his voice cracking like a teenage boy's. "I thought everything just went to you automatically." "Most of it did," I said, still holding Walter's letter. "But your father was a smart man, Greg. He loved you, but he also knew you." I read them the exact clause from the will, word for word. "In the event that my son Gregory shows disrespect for family obligations or proves himself unworthy of the Whitmore family legacy, ownership of the family home shall transfer immediately to the Charleston Baptist Church Building Fund." Ashley shot up from Walter's recliner like it had caught fire. "That's ridiculous. He can't do that. You can't just give away property based on some old man's hurt feelings." "Ashley," I said quietly, "that old man was my husband and Greg's father. And yes, he absolutely could do that. It's his will, witnessed and notarized." Greg was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "Mom, you're not seriously considering this, are you? Dad wrote that will years ago. He probably just put that in there as, I don't know, as insurance or something. He never meant for you to actually use it." "Then why did he hide a letter for me explaining exactly when and why I should use it?" I asked. I read them part of Walter's letter, the part about watching Greg change over the years, about how money had started mattering more than people. With every word, Greg's face got redder and Ashley's got stonier. "This is manipulation," Ashley declared, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. "It's emotional blackmail from beyond the grave." "No," I said, standing up to face her. "This is a father who loved his son enough to hope he'd never need to use this clause, but who was wise enough to know he might have to." Greg ran his hands through his thinning hair, the same gesture he'd made as a little boy when he was frustrated. "Mom, think about what you're saying. You're going to give away our family home to some church fund because Dad was upset about the funeral?" "The funeral?" I repeated, my voice getting stronger. "Greg, you missed your father's burial. You chose a birthday party over laying your own father to rest. And now, after a year of silence, you show up here wanting me to sell his house to fix your wife's financial mistakes." "They're not mistakes," Ashley snapped. "They're investments that didn't pan out. It happens in business." "Business," I said slowly. "Is that what family is to you, Ashley? A business opportunity?" She had the grace to look slightly ashamed, but only for a second. Then her jaw set in that stubborn line I'd seen so many times before. "Look, Eleanor, I understand you're upset about the funeral thing, but we're talking about your future here. What happens when you can't maintain this place anymore? What happens when you fall down those stairs or can't afford the property taxes?" "What happens," I said, "is that I'll deal with it when the time comes, just like Walter and I dealt with everything else for 51 years. Greg tried a different approach. He got that wheedling tone in his voice, the same one he'd used to talk me into letting him stay out past curfew when he was 16. "Mom, be reasonable. Dad's gone. He doesn't need the house anymore. And that church fund thing, that's just Dad being dramatic. You know how he could be sometimes." That did it. That was the line that broke something inside me. "Dramatic?" I said, my voice rising for the first time since they'd arrived. "Your father worked double shifts for 20 years to pay for this house. He built every cabinet in this kitchen with his own hands. He planted every tree in that yard. And you think honoring his final wishes is being dramatic?" The room went dead silent except for the tick of Walter's grandfather clock. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice steady as bedrock. "I'm going to honor your father's wishes. I'm going to do what he asked me to do." Greg's face went from red to white to red again. "You can't do this, Mom. I'm your son." "Yes," I said sadly. "You are my son, and that's exactly why this breaks my heart." Ashley grabbed her briefcase and headed for the door. "This is insane. We'll contest it. We'll get lawyers." "You do that," I said, "but Walter's will is ironclad. I already checked." As they stormed toward the door, Greg turned back one more time. "You'll regret this, Mom. When you're sitting in some nursing home with nothing left, don't come crying to me." The door slammed so hard it rattled the windows, and I sat down in Walter's recliner and smiled for the first time in a year. After Greg and Ashley left, the house felt different. Not empty. It had felt empty since Walter died. No, it felt peaceful. Like a weight I didn't even know I'd been carrying had finally been lifted off my shoulders. I walked through our home, really looking at it for the first time since Walter's funeral. The kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals together. The living room where we'd watched Greg take his first steps. The bedroom where we'd whispered dreams and fears in the darkness for 5 decades. Every corner held a memory. Every creaking floorboard told a story. But here's the thing about love, real love, the kind Walter and I shared. It's not about holding on to things. It's about making sure those things serve a purpose, even after you're gone. I thought about what Ashley had said, about what would happen when I couldn't maintain the place anymore. She wasn't entirely wrong. I was 73 years old, and this house was big for one person. The stairs were getting harder to climb, and the property taxes did eat up a chunk of my Social Security every month. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Walter had trusted me to make the right decision. He'd given me a choice, and he'd known I'd choose love over money, principle over convenience. That evening, I called Reverend Mills at Charleston Baptist. He was surprised to hear from me. We'd barely spoken since Walter's funeral, except for polite nods in the grocery store. "Eleanor," he said, "how are you holding up, dear?" "I'm doing better, Reverend. Actually, I'm calling because I need to discuss something important with you. Something about Walter's will." There was a pause. "Of course. Would you like me to come by?" "That would be wonderful." Reverend Mills arrived within the hour, carrying his worn leather Bible and that kind smile that had comforted so many families over the years. I made coffee and explained everything, Greg's request, Walter's hidden letter, the clause in the will. When I finished, Reverend Mills sat quietly for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Eleanor," he said finally, "are you certain this is what you want to do? Once we file these papers, there's no going back." "I'm certain," I said, and I was. For the first time in a year, I was absolutely certain about something. The church would use the property for housing assistance, he explained. We'd renovate it into apartments for families in need. Young couples just starting out, single mothers, elderly folks who need affordable housing. It would be a lasting legacy. A lasting legacy. Walter would have loved that. "But Eleanor," Reverend Mills continued, "what about you? Where will you go?" I'd been thinking about that all evening. "Remember Mrs. Peterson? She's been trying to convince me to move into that little guest house behind her place ever since Walter died. Says she could use the company and I could use the help with household chores." It was perfect, really. Mrs. Peterson was my age, a widow herself, and the guest house was cozy and manageable. More importantly, it was my choice, not something Greg and Ashley had planned for me like I was a piece of furniture they needed to store somewhere. "And you're comfortable with this decision?" Reverend Mills asked. Even though it means Greg gets nothing from the house," I finished. "Yes, I'm comfortable with it. Walter knew what he was doing when he wrote that clause. He knew our son better than I wanted to admit." We spent the next hour going over the legal details. Reverend Mills promised to have the church's lawyer review everything and start the transfer process. As he was leaving, he turned back to me. "Eleanor, I think Walter would be very proud of you." Standing there in the doorway of the house Walter and I had built together, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day of his funeral. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to do. Tomorrow, I would make it official. But tonight, I was going to say goodbye to this house the right way. Thursday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of spring day that makes you believe in new beginnings. I dressed in my best blue dress, the one Walter always said brought out my eyes, and drove downtown to the lawyer's office. Mr. Harrison, the church's attorney, was a kind man in his 60s who'd handled legal matters for Charleston Baptist for over 20 years. He'd already reviewed Walter's will and the transfer documents 3 times. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said as I signed the final papers, "I want you to understand that once these documents are filed, the house legally belongs to Charleston Baptist Church. There's no changing your mind after this." "I understand," I said, my handwriting steady as I signed my name. "This is what Walter wanted, and it's what I want too." Reverend Mills was there as a witness, along with Mrs. Henderson, who'd insisted on driving me to the appointment. She'd been worried about me making such a big decision alone, but when I explained Walter's letter to her, she'd wiped tears from her eyes and said, That man loved you both so much. The whole process took less than an hour. A lifetime of memories, 48 years of mortgage payments, and countless hours of Walter's labor, all transferred with a few signatures on legal documents. But it felt right. More than right, it felt like coming home to myself. Afterward, Reverend Mills walked me to my car. "The church board is already discussing plans for the renovation," he said. "We're thinking 4 small apartments, 2 on each floor. Each one would house a family who needs affordable housing. 4 families. Where Walter and I had raised one child who'd forgotten his values, 4 new families would get a fresh start. Children would learn to walk in the same living room where Greg had taken his first steps. Young couples would share dreams in the bedroom where Walter and I had planned our future." "There's something else," Reverend Mills added. "The board wants to put a small plaque by the front door, honoring Walter's memory and explaining that this housing exists because of his generosity. Would that be all right with you?" I had to blink back tears. Walter would have loved that. As I drove home to what was no longer technically my home, I felt lighter than I had in months. I'd spent the morning making arrangements with Mrs. Peterson about moving into her guest house. The little place was perfect for one person, with a tiny kitchen, a cozy living room, and a bedroom that looked out onto Mrs. Peterson's prize-winning rose garden. I'd also called a few local charities about donating Walter's furniture. Most of our things wouldn't fit in the guest house anyway, and I liked the idea of our belongings helping other families instead of gathering dust in storage. But there were some things I couldn't give away. Walter's grandfather clock, the one that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him, our wedding china, even though I'd probably never use it again, the quilts I'd made over the years, each one a labor of love, and Walter's tools. Greg had never shown any interest in them, but maybe someday there would be a young man who needed a good set of carpenter's tools to build something lasting. That afternoon, I sat in Walter's recliner one last time and called Greg. I knew I owed him that much a phone call to tell him what I'd done, rather than letting him find out some other way. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice cautious. "Mom? Greg, I wanted you to know that I signed the papers today. The house now belongs to Charleston Baptist Church." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "You actually did it," he said finally. "You actually gave away our family home." "I honored your father's wishes," I corrected, "just like he asked me to do." "This isn't over, Mom. Ashley's already talked to a lawyer. We're going to fight this." "You do what you feel you need to do, Greg, but your father's will is solid." Mr. Harrison assured me of that. Another long silence. Then, "I hope you're happy, Mom. I hope it was worth it." The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone, looking around at the home Walter and I had built with our own hands. In 2 weeks, I'd be living in Mrs. Peterson's guest house, and this place would belong to the church. Was I happy? Was it worth it? I thought about Walter's letter, about his trust in my judgment, about 4 families who would soon have affordable homes because of his foresight. Yes, it was absolutely worth it. What I didn't know was that my decision would soon trigger something I never saw coming. 3 days after I signed the papers transferring Walter's house to the church, Greg showed up at my door again. But this time, he wasn't alone, and he definitely wasn't wearing that nervous smile. Ashley stood beside him on my front porch, and behind them was a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. Greg's face was red with anger, and Ashley looked like she was ready for war. "Mom," Greg said through gritted teeth, "this is our lawyer, Mr. Davidson. We need to talk." I let them in, though every instinct told me not to. Mr. Davidson immediately took charge, spreading papers across my coffee table like he owned the place. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said in a voice smooth as snake oil, "I've reviewed your husband's will, and I believe there are grounds to contest it. The clause about your son being unworthy is subjective and potentially influenced by diminished mental capacity." Diminished mental capacity. They were going to claim Walter wasn't in his right mind when he wrote his will. "Walter's mind was sharp as a tack until the day he died," I said firmly. "Perhaps," Mr. Davidson continued, "but grief can cloud judgment. A 73-year-old woman making major financial decisions while mourning might not be thinking clearly." Now they were questioning my mental capacity too. Greg leaned forward, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, pure greed, mixed with desperation. "Mom, if you reverse this decision now, we can avoid a messy legal battle. Just call the church. Tell them you've changed your mind. And if I don't?" Ashley spoke up, her voice cold as winter rain. Then we'll have to explore all our legal options, including having you declared incompetent to make financial decisions. The room went dead silent. My own son was threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent to get his hands on Walter's house. I looked at Greg, really looked at him, and tried to find the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them sunshine flowers. The teenager who'd cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart. The young man who'd called me every Sunday from college just to hear my voice. That person was gone. In his place sat a stranger driven by money and Ashley's ambitions. "Get out," I said quietly. "Mom, just listen." "Get out of my house," I said louder. "All of you." Mr. Davidson gathered his papers with practiced efficiency. "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Whitmore. I suggest you reconsider your position." Ashley stood up, smoothing her skirt. "You're making a huge mistake, Eleanor. You're choosing strangers over your own family." "No," I said, walking them to the door. "You've already made that choice for me." As they reached the porch, Greg turned back one last time. The look on his face was one I'll never forget, pure hatred mixed with something else, something that scared me. "You think you've won," he said, "but this isn't over, not by a long shot." I watched them drive away, Greg's car disappearing down Magnolia Street, and I felt something shift inside me. Not regret. I didn't regret my decision for 1 second, but a deep sadness that it had come to this. That night I called Mrs. Henderson and told her everything. She came over with a bottle of wine and a listening ear. "Honey," she said as we sat in my kitchen, "I hate to say this, but maybe it's time to think about a security system, or at least new locks." "You think they'd actually try something?" Mrs. Henderson looked at me with concern in her eyes. "I think people do desperate things when money's involved." And Ashley looked desperate today. I thought about Greg's final words. This isn't over, not by a long shot. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was right. Maybe I should be worried about what they might do next. But I never imagined it would be what actually happened. 2 weeks later, I got the letter. And that's when I realized that someone had been watching me. Someone who knew exactly what buttons to push to terrify an old woman living alone. The question was, who? I'd been living in Mrs. Peterson's guest house for exactly 10 days when it happened. The moving had gone smoothly. Church volunteers had helped me pack up a lifetime of memories, and Reverend Mills himself had carried Walter's grandfather clock to my new little home. The guest house was cozy and comfortable, with morning sunlight streaming through gingham curtains and Mrs. Peterson's roses blooming just outside my bedroom window. I was finally starting to feel settled, maybe even a little hopeful about this new chapter of my life. That's when the letter arrived. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was having coffee on the little porch when Mrs. Peterson brought over the mail. Most of it was junk advertisements and credit card offers, but one envelope made my blood run cold. No return address, no postmark, just my name written in block letters across the front, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. Someone had hand-delivered this letter. I waited until Mrs. Peterson went back inside before I opened it. My hands were shaking as I tore the envelope, and what I found inside made me gasp out loud. A photograph of Walter's headstone, but someone had written across it in what looked like blood-red ink, "You shouldn't have done that, Mom." That was it. No other message, no signature, nothing else in the envelope. Just that photograph and those chilling words. "Mom, whoever sent this wanted me to think it came from Greg." But here's the thing, I knew my son's handwriting. I'd seen it on birthday cards and Christmas lists for 38 years. This wasn't Greg's writing. The letters were too neat, too carefully formed. Greg had always written in a messy scrawl, just like his father. So if Greg didn't send this letter, who did? I sat on that little porch for an hour, turning the photograph over and over in my hands, trying to make sense of it. Someone had gone to the cemetery, taken a picture of Walter's grave, defaced it with that horrible message, and then delivered it to my new address. But how did they know where I was living? I'd only given my new address to a handful of people, Mrs. Henderson, Reverend Mills, the post office, and a few close friends from church. The more I thought about it, the more frightened I became. This wasn't just a prank or an empty threat. Someone had been watching me. Someone knew my movements, knew where I lived, knew how to find me. That evening, I called the police. Officer Martinez, a young man who couldn't have been much older than Greg, took my statement and examined the photograph. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "do you have any idea who might want to intimidate you?" I told him about the house, about Greg and Ashley's threats, about the lawyer's visit. He wrote everything down carefully. "The thing is," I said, "I don't think my son sent this. The handwriting's all wrong." Officer Martinez nodded. "Sometimes people try to disguise their handwriting, or they might have someone else write it for them." Someone else. That possibility hadn't occurred to me. "We'll increase patrols in this neighborhood," he promised. "And Mrs. Whitmore, make sure you keep your doors locked. If you see anything suspicious, anything at all, you call us immediately." After he left, I sat in my little living room looking at that photograph, and one question kept running through my mind. If Greg didn't send this letter, and if someone else wrote it for him, then who was I really dealing with? And what were they planning to do next? Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every little sound made me jump, the house settling, Mrs. Peterson's cat prowling around outside, the wind rattling the windows. I kept that photograph on my nightstand, staring at it in the darkness, trying to piece together who could have sent such a thing. The next morning, Mrs. Peterson knocked on my door with fresh biscuits and concern written all over her face. "Eleanor, honey, you look terrible. What's wrong?" I showed her the letter. Mrs. Peterson's face went pale as she studied the photograph. "Who would do such a horrible thing?" she whispered. "That's what I can't figure out," I said. "Greg's angry, but this doesn't feel like something he'd do, and the handwriting's all wrong." Mrs. Peterson examined the envelope more closely. "You said there was no postmark?" "None. Someone walked right up to my mailbox and put it there." "In broad daylight? That takes nerve." "Mrs." Peterson set down her coffee cup with a determined clink. "I'm calling my nephew Danny. He works nights at the security company downtown. Maybe he can install some cameras around here." But before she could reach for the phone, we heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the window, I saw Ashley's silver BMW parked behind my little Honda. My heart started racing. What was she doing here? Ashley marched up to the guest house door like she owned the place, her high heels clicking on the wooden steps. When I opened the door, she pushed past me without invitation. "We need to talk, Eleanor. I think we've said everything we need to say." Ashley turned to face me, and something in her expression made my blood run cold. It wasn't anger this time, it was calculation, like she was sizing me up for something. "Have you gotten any interesting mail lately?" she asked. The question hit me like a slap. "What did you say?" "I asked if you'd gotten any interesting mail, you know, the kind that might make an old woman reconsider her recent decisions." Mrs. Peterson stepped closer to me, protective as a mother hen. "What are you talking about, young lady?" Ashley's smile was sharp as a knife. "I'm talking about the photograph that was delivered yesterday, the one of Walter's grave." The room went dead silent. Ashley knew about the letter, which meant either she'd sent it, or whoever sent it had told her about it. "You sent that?" I whispered. "I didn't say that," Ashley replied smoothly, "but I will say this, that letter is just the beginning. You think giving away Greg's inheritance was the end of this? You're wrong, dead wrong." She headed for the door, then turned back with that cold smile still on her face. "Enjoy your little guest house, Eleanor, while you still can." After she left, Mrs. Peterson and I sat in stunned silence. "Eleanor," Mrs. Peterson said finally, "I don't think Greg's the one you need to worry about." She was right. Greg might be angry and greedy, but Ashley was something else entirely. Ashley was dangerous. And I was starting to realize I had no idea what she was capable of. But I was about to find out. The truth came out 3 days later, and it wasn't at all what I expected. I was having dinner with Mrs. Peterson when her nephew Danny arrived to install the security cameras. He was a nice young man, maybe 30, with kind eyes and gentle hands as he worked. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned you've been having some trouble," he said as he mounted a camera above my front door. "Someone's been sending threatening letters," I explained. Danny nodded sympathetically. "Well, these cameras will record everything, day and night. If someone comes around here again, we'll have them on video." But as it turned out, we didn't need to wait for another visit. Danny was testing the camera system when his phone rang. After a brief conversation, he turned to me with a puzzled expression. "Mrs. Whitmore, that was my supervisor at the security company. Apparently someone called this morning asking about surveillance equipment for this address. They wanted to know about camera blind spots and motion sensor ranges." My blood turned to ice. "Someone called asking about my security system?" "Yeah. Said they were a family member concerned about your safety. But here's the weird part, it was a woman's voice, and she knew way too much about security systems for a concerned relative. Ashley." Of course it was Ashley. But why would Ashley be calling about my security system unless she was planning something? That's when everything clicked into place. The threatening letter wasn't meant to scare me into giving up the house. It was too late for that. The house already belonged to the church. No, the letter was meant to establish a pattern, to make it look like I was being stalked, being threatened, to make what happened next seem like the logical conclusion to an escalating situation. Ashley wasn't trying to get the house back. She was planning something much worse. I called Officer Martinez immediately. When I explained about Ashley's visit, her veiled threats, and now the phone call about my security system, his voice got very serious. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to stay with Mrs. Peterson tonight. Don't go back to the guest house alone. We're going to set up surveillance." "You think she's really planning to hurt me?" "I think," Officer Martinez said carefully, "that some people will do anything for money. And if something happened to you, and your son inherited everything you own." He didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood. If I died, Greg would inherit my savings, my life insurance, everything, and Ashley had probably calculated that even without the house, my estate would be enough to solve their financial problems. The threatening letter wasn't random intimidation. It was Ashley setting the stage to make my death look like the work of some unknown stalker. But here's what Ashley didn't count on. She'd underestimated a 73-year-old woman who'd spent 51 years married to a man who taught her to always be prepared for anything. Walter might be gone, but he'd taught me well, and I wasn't going down without a fight. As I sit here now, safe in Mrs. Peterson's house with police protection and security cameras recording everything, I want you to remember something. Sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes it comes from family members who've forgotten what family really means. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world where it's late at night, hold your loved ones a little closer. And if you're watching where it's morning, remember that every new day is a chance to choose love over greed, family over money. Thanks for joining me for Eleanor's story here on Madam Susan's Stories. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And remember, sometimes taking the last step means standing your ground and protecting what really matters. Until next time, stay strong, stay vigilant, and never let anyone make you forget your worth.